It's much easier usually, unless you're speaking to a historian. No offense to historians. But I did, I know. It was so funny.
PLA modernization.
Yes, PLA modernization. I think there are some really good potential optimistic points for the future, and there are also some very negative points for the future. And to try and predict what's going to happen, I think really depends on the domestic situation inside the PRC. Will it stay economically stable? And if it stays economically stable, then we could preclude that it will probably stay socially stable. But if that economic variable starts to tumble, then I think it will start to head in a relatively bad direction. Partly because of domestic leadership, partly because of questions over control over the PLA. Now that the PLA is running rogue, but the PLA, the major officer cadre in the PLA, does not have combat experience. They do show certain bravado that doesn't bode well if a conflict were to arise. The major restraining factor, I think, with the PLA is that they still lack the force projection capability. They've acquired an aircraft carrier. That aircraft carrier still lacks the radar capabilities to really be able to project the aircraft forward. So even though they have the required new Savoys, they just simply don't have a large travel range. So on the issue of whether the PLA is latching itself onto Taiwan independence issue or an energy issue, I think that the PLA is latching onto whatever gets them the budget. For a while, it was a Taiwan independence issue, and for about the last 5 years, it's been an energy issue, which, once you look at it, once you map it out and look at the ranges, it simply doesn't make sense. I think the PLA has been on a shopping spree, while it can go on a shopping spree. I think that's about it, looking inside the black box. We really don't know what it is that they're thinking and how they would react in a crisis, because we don't have that inside information and we don't have past experience to base it on. So, for lack of a better prediction, it can go either really, really well, or it can go really, really poorly. Status quo would be ideal, but there are some other factors that go into that we can discuss later.
Coming back to the change of leadership on the mainland, the best comment I've heard about Xi Jinping is, if you look at his French title, Xi Duxi, you read this way, Xi Duxi, but you read backward, it's also Xi Duxi. And the same applies to Li Dongli. You read this way, it's Li Dongli, and you better read backward, it's Li Dongli.
Okay. The era of palindromes is
Okay, I think we should pay attention to what the 18th Party Congress report says, which reflects Xi Jinping's views. I think the most important thing that it says in the report is that by 2049, which is the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China, he or the party wishes that China will be not only a strong country but a democratic one. Now, many people miss that, and I think it's important because this shows what? That because Xi Jinping was a party secretary in Fujian for a long time, and he knows Taiwan very well, and he knows that without democratic change in China, the hope of unification will be nil. And therefore, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but there is a chance that Xi Jinping realizes that unless mainland China changes to the direction of democracy, there is no hope for unification. And this is maybe President Ma has caught this. That's why he mentioned that Taiwan is a beacon of hope for democracy in China. And you put the two things together, it cannot be by coincidence. Furthermore, there's something funny happening within Taiwan. I think that's one reason to go into. There's something very strange going on in Taiwan within the opposition party. Both Su Zhenchang and Xu Xinliang have come out criticizing, well, first saying that the DPP should establish a platform of dialogue with mainland. more than before. Secondly, criticizing implicitly, mind you, for not pushing the current relationship further to the political domain. And Xi Jinping even wrote a 10,000-word thesis saying that Taiwan is ready to discuss, or Taiwan should be ready to discuss a political dialogue and a peace agreement with China. Now, Ma Ying-jeou has been reluctant to do this because he was afraid that he might be accused of selling Taiwan out to mainland China. But now, since DPP has criticized him, I think he has removed a very significant barrier from his taking the next step. And I think it's hopeful that movement toward the direction of a peace dialogue, peaceful agreement will be involved.
Well, I think you're a bit more optimistic than perhaps President Ma was about the possibility of short-term political change on the mainland, where he does indeed, of course, hold Taiwan out as a beacon of democracy, but I think also said in his remarks that while he will press human rights and other issues, so the June 4th speech and such, that major political change is not in the offing. But the dialogue you refer to, both the debate going on in the mainland is certainly there. There's much more talk about this. Talk about hazardous areas to make predictions. The optimists would say the crunch has finally come and it's time really to change. And if you don't, hope may be lost. On the other hand, there are people who find similarities between what Xi Jinping has been saying and what Hu Jintao said 10 years ago about rule of law, constitutionalism, progress toward democracy. So it will be a while before we know. But to shift back to the security type issues and the cross-strait issues, you mentioned earlier the U.S. pivot, and I want to broaden that focus a little bit and tie it to the Taiwan context in particular. Obviously, there is a robust U.S.-Taiwan security relationship founded in many things, and alignments of interest and the legal obligations of the Taiwan Relations Act, the support of the Taiwan choice in Congress, and so on. Arms sales are obviously going to recur as an issue. There's much discussion in Congress of the F-16 CD sales and whether to push that beyond the modernization of the F-16 ADs. And there are all these kinds of recurring questions. So I wonder if you would speak to the implications for U.S.-Taiwan security relations of the pivot or rebalancing toward Asia and the change in U.S. military doctrine toward air-sea battle and that kind of broader discussion of U.S. security approaches to East Asia, including U.S. views of the China threat, which has become more prominent, I think, in DoD analysis. What does that mean, not just for U.S. policy for the region, but for Taiwan's place in U.S. policy toward the region and U.S.-China relations?
Well, to answer the initial question first, one way of understanding the security relationship is to look at what happened with Taiwan's agreement with Japan on access to the Senkaku Islands area. This was a wonderful diplomatic event, and it happened right when China was very busy expanding and dealing with the reactions from its neighbors in the South China Sea. And I think that is another way of looking at the U.S. pivot in Asia and looking at the growing military relationship with Taiwan, with the Philippines, looking at the potential for relationship in Vietnam, is that none of these countries are operating inside a vacuum. China's not operating inside a vacuum, and countries are beginning to push back. China's hedging for the future against significant uncertainties, and now other countries are learning that they need to hedge as well. Another factor that comes into play in this is India. India doesn't really get a lot of airtime or very much traction and analysis. It pursues much of the same foreign policy that China pursues without the negative publicity. So that's another factor that comes into play in looking at balancing against the PRC. Looking at specific security issues and the air-sea battle, criticism came out of PRC on the U.S. air-sea battle concept that this was directed at Taiwan. But in fact, it's directed at the South China Sea, the East China Sea, it's looking beyond the Pacific, specifically because of all these other countries and over the last decade, their reaction to China's expansion. So China's putting forth the Axis area denial weaponry, and the U.S. is putting forth countering weapons to that. There is a significant potential for cooperation on the military technology with Taiwan beyond just arms sales. And I think on the issue of arms sales, the most important point is that regardless of the diplomatic further that occurs with each arms sales, is that the arms sales continue to occur. We may say, okay, we're going to limit, or we won't sell the F-16 this time, but we still sell a significant amount of weapons to Taiwan, much to China's dismay. On the specific military partnerships, I think that there's a lot of room for cooperation on cybersecurity issues. There's room for cooperation on tapping into Taiwan's UHF radar, looking at their undersea understanding in the Taiwan Strait. So there's a variety of a large variety of opportunity for cooperation in the South China Sea with Taiwan. At the same time, I think there's some growing pushback from inside the United States that Taiwan's cross-strait relationship with PRC has been so good that some policymakers and some analysts are beginning to say, you know, this really isn't an issue anymore, or it's not a concern for us anymore. And to answer that criticism, I will say my initial comment is this is about Taiwan, but it's not just about Taiwan. Taiwan's not in a bubble. China's not in a bubble. It's about the South China Sea. And it's also about moving farther west, looking at sea lines of communication. You're looking at Pakistan. You're looking at India. You're looking at the African continent, the fastest developing area in the world. The U.S. is paying attention to this. We are sending troops to parts of Africa. We are establishing federal agency offices in Africa, and we now have stationed Marines in Australia. So I think in a broader picture, we're looking back at that power shift, and it's important to look at these separate issues and see how they relate to the big picture in order to better understand what are some of the potentials for the future.
Thank you. June, if I get you to pick up on a couple of threads here. We've had a series of offered arms sales, not all of which have led to purchases. And in Washington, I think it's fair to say there's been a lack of consensus on how to think of Taiwan in U.S. security involvement in the Western Pacific. So I think there was a time when it would be fair to say the trend line was headed towards seeing, particularly during the Chun years, towards seeing Taiwan as the most likely precipitating cause of an avoidable conflict with China. And now we're getting a much more nuanced and complicated thing. Where does Taiwan fit in the pivot when Taiwan is not a formal security ally since the cancellation of the Mutual Security Treaty back in 1979, but it still is a close cooperator, and it's part of that ring that includes formal treaty allies like Korea and Japan. So we're starting to hear more of Taiwan as the cork in the bottle again. So what's your read of where the state of play is on that? And I'd like to ask all the panelists what Taiwan can do to enhance its security ties or preserve its security ties with the U.S., given the complexity of U.S. views of where Taiwan fits in U.S. Western Pacific security strategy, and given this issue of some in the U.S. would say, you know, we keep offering to sell weapons, they don't get bought, there's a cost with China to making the offer. So if you would care to take on each of those.
Well, really, the position that Ma has taken is toward the People's Republic of China is a position that he seemed to be nudged in the direction of by U.S. policy itself after, as you mentioned, President Bush was so critical of Chen Shui-bian. So that did push him into a position, I mean, I think he had the ideal already, but it pushed him into a position of rapprochement, which now a lot of people in Washington are thinking maybe went too far, and they are trying to rethink what to do here. But the Taiwan government has been very reluctant to buy arms. And you find that arms packages are offered, and then something always seems to happen. And sometimes, of course, the things that are asked for don't happen anyway. And, you know, you mentioned that the PRC reacts very badly, Professor Wolf. I think a large part of it is for show, because the F-16ABs, even in their upgraded form, are no match. I mean, even the CDs are no match for the Sukhoi 35s that the Chinese Air Force is getting. And so what we have been doing is selling far less than state of the art, even when we agree to sell. And I think the PRC uses that as a lever against us, and it only works as a lever if we accept it works as a lever, which so far we have, which bothers me a lot, because I want Taiwan to be able to defend itself. And then there's certain reluctance on the part of Taiwan to buy whatever is offered, partly because it isn't state of the art. And so you get in a kind of mutually reinforcing downward spiral on this, which frankly concerns me. And then you have policymakers in Washington saying, and they do, why should we be prepared to defend Taiwan if Taiwan is not willing to defend itself? And at some point, I think it is necessary for people, as we used to say in the US government, people above our pay grade, to have a full and frank exchange of views privately with the leadership of Taiwan on just what they want. You know, in preparation for a talk I gave at the Woodrow Wilson Center in February, I actually queried the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Taiwan about what part they thought Taiwan should play in this pivot. And they came back with, we don't see, I mean, because they're too vigorous a player in the pivot, and they look anti-China. And they wrote back, and I have it in writing, Chinese and English, that we don't consider the pivot to be directed against China, and therefore we would like to participate in it to the extent we can. And obviously, the pivot is directed against China. So where do we go from here? It's another, I mean, I value, I'm not an ambiguous person myself, as you can tell. I have a certain appreciation of the value of ambiguity, but when it leads to muddled statements, it's not helpful.
Well, I agree with one point you made, Joan, that the PLA has to put up a show. They have to pretend they're angry, because I know they fully understand that there is a gun lobby in Washington, and that Taiwan has to buy arms from Washington in order to make the gun lobby happy. And the gun lobby, of course, is you know, one of the biggest contributors to both parties, Republican and Democrat. Then I think the United States probably has one apprehension that if this rapprochement between Taiwan and England
pose this about looking at it perhaps from Taiwan's perspective as well as from the perspective of other friendly nations in that part of the world. How seriously should the U.S. pivot be taken? I mean, the skeptical view is it's all talk, and it's a bigger part of a fast-shrinking pie that is being allocated toward Asia. So, are we really credible?